Would you pray with me? O Lord, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts together be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today in worship, we are observing All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day was actually on Friday. It's always the day after Halloween. But we didn't think you would come to church on Friday, and so we celebrated on the first Sunday of November. All Saints began in the context of Catholic feast days for saints. As the number of saints exceeded the number of days on the calendar, the church ran out of days and needed something to solve the problem. So All Saints' Day was created as a sort of all the other saints' day on which to celebrate the memory of the many saints of our faith. Recently, I've started listening to a Catholic podcast called Jesuitical. It's a play on the word Jesuit because the podcast is produced by the American Review, which is a Jesuit magazine. The hosts are not Jesuit priests, they are faithful lay Catholics who work for the magazine, and the podcast is not nearly as stuffy as it sounds. They begin each episode by telling the listeners what cocktail they're drinking to accompany the day's interview, followed by Catholic news from around the world, and then an interview. A few weeks ago, they interviewed Representative Ro Khanna, a congressman from California who represents the Silicon Valley, and who also happens to be one of 4 practicing Hindus in the U.S. Congress. When you hear Silicon Valley, you probably don't immediately think faith and religion. But it turns out Ro Khanna's district in the Silicon Valley is teeming with faith, with churches and synagogues and temples and mosques. They were interviewing Khanna about his own faith and how it influences his politics. He described to them his commitment to peacemaking, to the work of justice, and to the work of immigration. He described how he has worked through interfaith dialogue to bridge the divides between India and Pakistan. And he's worked to help members of the Democratic Party bridge their own divides on understanding faith. At the end of every Jesuitical podcast interview, the hosts ask the same question of every guest. If you could canonize any person, living or dead, Catholic or non-Catholic, who would it be and why? Representative Khanna answered that question this way. He said, Gandhi. Partly it's because his grandfather worked with Gandhi in the India independence movement before they immigrated to the U.S. But even more, he said, I would name Gandhi a saint because of his commitment to human rights and to the work of political and social change through nonviolence. He reminded me in the interview of something that I saw when Jeremy and I went with our youth to Montgomery. If you go into the parsonage of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church where King led the civil rights movement in Montgomery, you'll find on King's desk 2 books, a Bible and a Gandhi reader. On this All Saints' Day Sunday, it's illuminating for us to answer that question for ourselves. Maybe you want to ask it over lunch to one another. If you could canonize any person, living or dead, Catholic or non-Catholic, who would it be and why? Some of us would name people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela, people whose lives have radiated with a special kind of grace and who have made the world more peaceful, more just, and more holy. Many of us would do the same thing that Ro Khanna did, sort of. We would name someone whose life has intersected ours in some personal way. Perhaps a grandmother or a grandfather, maybe a parent, a teacher or a mentor or a friend. If we had the power to make a saint, I'm sure that all of us would name that person whose life has been a vessel for the love and grace of God. That's what a saint is, whether it's on a world stage or on the stage of your own heart, a person through whom the love of God is made known, whose life makes God visible, even believable in the world. In a few minutes, we'll give thanks for the lives of the people we have known and recalled for this day. We'll give thanks for the saints in our church and in our lives who have embodied the love of God for us. And we will give thanks that even though they have died because of the love of God in Jesus Christ, they are not lost. They live now in communion with the saints in light. Thanks be to God. Over the past 2 months here at First Pres, we've been working our way through the saints of Genesis, the heroes of the faith that are found in Genesis: Noah, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. Today we are concluding our series of Genesis on this All Saints Sunday with what is often called the blessings of Jacob, the reading that you may have never heard before that Julie gave to us a few moments ago. The opening verses of this chapter 49 give you the impression that Jacob has gathered his 12 sons to his deathbed to bless each of them. But if you read it closely, you'll find that's not the case at all. And this chapter should in no way be titled The Blessings of Jacob. Jacob does, in the story, gather 12 sons, but some of them are blessed and some of them are cursed. And some of them receive such a small mention that they are practically forgotten. In my reading, the way that Julie read it, Judah and Joshua get a lot of ink, but we skip over a lot of others. Reuben, at the very beginning of chapter 49, is cursed for things that are better left unsaid. You can read it for yourself. Simon and Levi, they too are cursed. Later on down, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali barely get a mention. Biblical scholars tell us that this text in Genesis was almost certainly composed much later than the time of Jacob. It is not written to tell us what happened on Jacob's deathbed, but it is written to define history for us. It is written to elevate some and put away others. It's written to fit the story of Israel's life with the facts of Israel's life. Much like some of the later prophets also wrote about the past in the future tense to shape how we understand the story, so this writer in Genesis is writing about Jacob's blessings and curses to shape how we understand the history of Israel. Like all of us do in our family stories, we remember some people and tell their story often. We would prefer to forget others and not mention their story very much. It's hard to know what to do with this list of blessings and curses. I chose this text for All Saints Sunday 2 or 3 months ago. I was dismayed to read this week that one commentator says that there is nothing of theological value in this chapter. That sets the challenge. One more incisive commentator remarked that many of us would do exactly what we did this morning. We would skip over the challenging parts of chapter 49 and just focus on the heroes, Joshua and Joseph. And this particularly incisive commentator said that if we do that, which we did, that would be a serious mistake. For if there is anything worthwhile theologically in this strange collection of sayings at the end of Genesis, it is this. It is the fervent conviction that the living God is at work in the history of this people, saints and sinners alike. You see, God made a promise to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, and it was never conditioned on Abraham being a saint. It was not conditioned on Abraham being holy or noble or virtuous. It wasn't even conditioned on Abraham's faith. The promise was made to Abraham simply because God chose Abraham. The blessing has always been about God's grace and never about our merits. You see, it's not hard to see how God blessed the earth through the lives of great saints like Joshua and Joseph, through the deathless witness of a martyr like Perpetua or a pastor like Augustine, a lover of the poor like Francis, a theologian like Aquinas, a servant like Teresa, a drum major for justice like King. Through their lives, the love of God becomes almost tangibly real. They're the Judahs and the Josephs of our faith family. But if we only name the Judahs and the Josephs of the faith family, we miss the real power of God's grace. Name the Reubens, the ones whose deeds you can't talk about in polite society. Name Levi and Simon, who are cursed for their violence. Name Gad and Asher and Naphtali, the ones who were insignificant and mostly forgotten. Name the ones who have failed. Name the ones who did not believe in themselves or in God at all. And the promise of God comes alive. Through these people, these unlikely saints, saints by grace alone, God has promised to bless the earth. You see, all of us have in our family tree a mix. We've all got some Joshuas and Judas. We've also got some Reubens and Levis and Simons. And within ourselves, we each have a mix. We've got some Joshua and Judah days where we're a hero of the faith. But we've also got some Reuben days and some Levi and Simon days that we wish we could take back. And we've got some Gad and Naphtali days where we feel awfully insignificant. The good news of All Saints' Day for us is not that we pick out some great examples of the faith that are inspiring. I mean, that's not nothing. The good news of All Saints' Day is that we get to claim the grace and power of God to make saints of the rest of us. Saints of all of us. The good news of All Saints' Day is that God is at work through our story, through our lives, that none of us are perfect, that we are saint and sinner alike, and yet God is at work in us to make saints of us, to make a company of saints of us. You heard Brian say a few moments ago enthusiastically, I've not seen a stewardship chair as enthusiastic about stewardship as Brian is. Give thanks for him. Brian said a few moments ago that in the month of November, we are going to focus on stewardship as we prepare our church budget for 2020. The session is asking each of us to make a financial commitment to the church for the coming year. Your pledges, your gifts are crucial to the work of ministry that we can do in 2020. We've got hopes, we've got dreams, we've got plans. I believe that if we share our resources with the church and one another, we have more than enough to do what God is calling us to do. You also heard Brian mention an art project that symbolizes our stewardship this year. It's just out there in the hallway, in the atrium. It's a tree. And there are leaves that need to go on that tree. They're beside the tree, green leaves with markers where you're asked to write a prayer or a need or a hope and to glue it and put it on that tree so that together we make the tree green. As Brian said in his letter that's in your packets downstairs, the everlasting love of Jesus Christ has the power to hold many individual green leaves in one mighty tree. That's a message of Christ's love that gathers up our gifts and lives for God's purposes. That's stewardship, how God uses what we have. It's also a message for All Saints' Day about the power of Christ to gather up a surprising communion of saints and hold them together in one body. I wonder what would happen if we took that question from the Jesuitical podcast and turned it another way. When we ask ourselves the question, if you could canonize anyone living or dead, Catholic or non-Catholic, who would it be? we pick out a hero of the faith, a Gandhi or a King or a Mandela. But I wonder what would happen if we asked Jesus that question. Jesus, if you could canonize any person, living or dead, Catholic or non-Catholic, who would it be and why? The answer Jesus gives is all of them. I would make saints out of all of you, Jesus says. For the love and grace of God is that deep and that wide that none are left and none are forgotten, to the glory of God now and forever. Amen.